Between 1941 and 1943, as the world settled into the long violence of global war, an unexpected symbol of power emerged far from the front lines. It did not arrive with a cannon's roar or a fleet review. It took shape instead in American shipyards, where steel plates were welded together with unprecedented speed. In a conflict defined by destruction, this was an act of creation. The Liberty ship was not elegant, nor fast, nor heavily armed, but it represented something the war had begun to prize above all else: scale. At the time, Allied leaders understood the crisis in simple terms. Men and weapons were useless if they could not reach the battlefield. Across the Atlantic, German submarines were sinking merchant vessels faster than they could be replaced. Supply lines stretched thin, and every convoy loss echoed far beyond the ocean. The belief persisted that industrial power could eventually compensate, but only if production could outpace destruction. For the first time, victory depended not just on tactics, but on tempo. There was a quiet irony in how the war at sea was changing. Naval history had once revolved around fleets and admirals, around decisive battles and superior seamanship. Now, the balance was shifting inland. The outcome of the Atlantic struggle was being shaped less by naval engagements than by factory output. Shipyards, not ship captains, were becoming the decisive weapons. Steel, schedules, and standardized parts mattered as much as guns. The central struggle was one of credibility. Could a seaworthy cargo ship truly be built in days rather than months? Early claims bordered on the unbelievable. A 4-day construction time sounded less like engineering and more like propaganda. Traditional shipbuilders scoffed. Corners, they warned, could not be cut without consequences. The ocean, unlike a factory floor, did not forgive mistakes. Then the numbers began to speak for themselves. Hulls slid into the water almost as soon as blueprints were finalized. Welding replaced riveting. Sections were prefabricated and assembled like components on an assembly line. Losses continued, but for the first time, sinkings were matched and then surpassed by launches. The arithmetic of war began to change. What the Liberty ship revealed was not merely a faster way to build vessels, but a new philosophy of warfare. Quantity became a form of quality. Speed became strategy. And as these ships crossed the Atlantic in growing numbers, it became clear that the future of the war would belong to. By the early years of the war, the belief in Washington was stark and unavoidable. The United States could produce weapons, vehicles, and food in astonishing quantities, but none of it mattered if it could not cross the Atlantic. Merchant shipping had become the quiet backbone of the Allied war effort. Without a steady flow of cargo, armies would starve of ammunition, fuel, and replacement parts long before they faced the enemy. The war, it was becoming clear, would be decided not only by what America made, but by how quickly it could move it. The shock came from the sea lanes themselves. Allied convoys were being torn apart with relentless efficiency. German U-boats prowled the Atlantic, exploiting gaps in escort coverage and sinking ships faster than they could be replaced. Entire cargoes vanished in minutes. Steel, food, vehicles, and lives swallowed without warning. In London, planners counted losses with growing alarm. In Washington, the numbers told a grim story. The enemy did not need to defeat Allied armies if he could simply prevent them from being supplied. There was a bitter irony in the response. Traditional shipbuilding, refined over decades, was too slow for a war measured in weeks and months rather than years. Skilled labor was limited. Construction schedules stretched endlessly. Even as shipyards worked at full capacity, sinkings outpaced production. Craftsmanship, once a point of pride, had become a liability. The Atlantic blockade was not being broken by superior firepower, but by time itself. The struggle was urgent and unforgiving. Every delay meant another convoy exposed, another front weakened, another calculation tilted toward collapse. American planners understood that incremental improvements would not be enough. The solution had to be radical. Ships would have to be built faster than logic allowed, faster than tradition permitted. Failure was not theoretical. It would be measured in lost battles thousands of miles away. Out of this pressure emerged a revelation that reshaped modern warfare. The Liberty ship was not designed to be perfect, it was designed to be fast. Standardized, simplified, and assembled with industrial discipline, it transformed shipbuilding into a process of mass production. Speed replaced elegance. Numbers replaced rarity. What had seemed impossible became routine. And as these ships began to slide into the water in unprecedented numbers, the Atlantic's balance quietly shifted. Yet even this solution raised a deeper question whether speed alone. The shock did not come from a battlefield, but from a shipyard clock. Across the United States, production records that once defined the limits of industry began to fall with unsettling regularity. Hulls took shape in days rather than months. Launch schedules compressed until one vessel entered the water almost as another left the slipway. In a war measured by attrition, America introduced a new variable: speed on an industrial scale. At first, the belief sounded more like bravado than planning. A fully functional cargo ship built in 4 days defied everything shipbuilders had been taught. The sea was unforgiving, and haste had always been its enemy. Yet the pressure of war left little room for caution. Each launch was a test not only of engineering, but of faith in a new way of thinking. The clock became as important as the blueprint. The irony lay in the ship itself. The Liberty ship was not sleek or advanced. Its lines were plain, its systems intentionally simple. It was designed not to impress, but to endure. Where past vessels had emphasized refinement, this one embraced repetition. It was a workhorse, built to carry, not to conquer. In another era, such a ship might have been dismissed as uninspired. Behind the scenes, the struggle was relentless. Engineers simplified designs to their bare essentials. Workers, many of them new to heavy industry, learned tasks in hours rather than years. Welders replaced riveters. Prefabricated sections arrived by rail, ready to be assembled like components of a larger machine. Mistakes were made, corrected, and absorbed into the process. There was no time for perfection, only for progress. What emerged from this pressure was a revelation that extended far beyond shipbuilding. Mass production itself became a weapon. By breaking complex construction into repeatable steps, the United States transformed its industrial base into an engine of war. Ships were no longer singular achievements. They were outputs. Losses at sea were answered not with despair, but with schedules. As Liberty ships began to cross the Atlantic in growing numbers, the enemy faced a problem no torpedo could solve. The question was no longer whether ships would be sunk, but whether they could ever be sunk fast enough. For generations, shipbuilding had followed a familiar rhythm. Vessels were conceived slowly, refined carefully, and assembled over many patient months. Strength came from craftsmanship, and reliability from tradition. Against this background, America's wartime promise sounded almost reckless. A new cargo ship, planners claimed, could be designed and built not for permanence, but for speed. In a war that punished hesitation, simplicity would replace refinement. The shock was evident the moment the Liberty ship took form on the drafting table. Its lines were blunt, its profile lacked grace. There was no attempt to disguise its purpose or elevate its appearance. Every curve, every compartment, served a single function: to move cargo across dangerous water as quickly as possible. Where earlier ships carried the marks of naval pride, this one carried the marks of necessity. The irony lay in how deliberate that simplicity was. By stripping the design to its essentials, engineers made it ideal for mass production. Parts could be standardized. Sections could be prefabricated miles away and assembled on site with minimal adjustment. Yet to traditionalists, this efficiency came at a cost. A ship built so quickly, they argued, could not possibly endure the stresses of the Atlantic. Elegance, in their view, had always been a form of strength. That doubt fueled a quiet struggle. Welded hulls, still a relative novelty, replaced riveted seams that had proven themselves over decades. New workers, many with no prior shipyard experience, were trained in weeks. Inspection routines were shortened, schedules tightened. Each decision traded reassurance for momentum. The sea would be the final judge, and it would not offer second chances. Reports soon surfaced that seemed to confirm the critics' fears. Cracks appeared in hulls. Structural failures were documented in cold northern waters. Every flaw was magnified by the stakes of war. If the Liberty ship failed, it would not merely sink cargo, it would sink the very idea that speed could substitute for tradition. Engineers responded not with retreat, but with adaptation, reinforcing designs and refining welding techniques even as production continued. What emerged was not a perfect vessel, but a reliable one. The Liberty ship was never meant to be admired. It was meant to arrive, loaded with tanks, fuel, food, and ammunition. It fulfilled its purpose with stubborn consistency. It crossed oceans not because it was beautiful, but because it was there, again and again, when it was needed. From design to dock, the ship embodied a new truth of modern war. Survival did not always belong to the strongest or the finest, but to the fastest system capable. The shock of America's entry into total war was not confined to troop movements or naval deployments. It unfolded across the factory floors of an entire nation. Almost overnight, the United States mobilized its industrial base on a scale the world had never witnessed. Assembly lines lengthened, shifts multiplied. Cities that once slept through the night now glowed continuously, their windows lit by the steady rhythm of production. War had come home, not with bombs, but with schedules. The belief guiding this transformation was both simple and ambitious. Factories would become the backbone of the war effort, not in a symbolic sense, but in a literal one. Every mile advanced overseas depended on output measured in tons and hours. Industrial planners understood that victory would favor the side that could replace losses faster than the enemy could inflict them. In this war, endurance would be manufactured. There was deep irony in what these factories became. Only years earlier, they had produced automobiles, refrigerators, washing machines, objects of comfort and aspiration. Now those same lines were retooled to produce hull sections, engines, and steel plates by the thousands. The familiar language of consumer choice gave way to quotas and deadlines. Variety vanished. Standardization ruled. What once symbolized abundance was repurposed for survival. The struggle behind this transformation was relentless. Millions of workers were absorbed into war production, many for the first time. Women filled roles long denied to them. Migrant labor reshaped entire regions. Training was accelerated. Errors were costly. Fatigue was constant. Yet morale held not because the work was easy, but because its purpose was clear. Each completed section, each launched ship, was a direct answer to a sinking somewhere at sea. The pressure never eased. Machines broke down. Supply bottlenecks emerged. Steel allocations were argued over with near strategic urgency. Still, production climbed. Yard by yard, the system adapted. Output became predictable, then overwhelming. Where Axis planners counted ships sunk, American planners counted ships delivered, and the numbers began to diverge sharply. The revelation was unmistakable. This was not merely industrial participation in war. It was industrial dominance. The factories did not just support the front lines, they reshaped them. The Axis powers could fight bravely and skillfully, but they could not match an opponent whose factories learned faster than they could destroy. By the time Liberty ships were leaving the docks in steady streams, the balance had shifted in ways no single battle could measure. The war was no longer only a contest of armies and fleets, but of systems and stamina. And somewhere between the clang of steel and the hum of... In wartime, belief often hardens into doctrine. By 1942, one principle was becoming impossible to ignore. Speed mattered as much as design. A well-built ship that arrived too late was no victory at all. The Atlantic did not reward elegance or tradition. It rewarded continuity, the unbroken movement of supplies across contested water. For the Allies, survival depended on whether production could keep pace with loss. The shock came when the arithmetic of war was finally confronted. German U-boats could sink ships faster than conventional yards could replace them. Months of careful construction vanished in minutes beneath the waves. But when a vessel could be launched in days rather than months, the equation changed. Losses no longer carried the same strategic weight. For the first time, destruction could be absorbed rather than feared. There was an irony in how quickly this logic took hold. Only a few years earlier, the idea of building a major seagoing ship in a matter of days would have been dismissed as irresponsible, even dangerous. Shipbuilding had always been a slow craft, governed by patience and precision. Yet war stripped away those assumptions. What had once seemed reckless became necessary. Speed was no longer a compromise, it was a requirement. The struggle to achieve it tested every link in the production chain. Design had to be simplified without sacrificing basic integrity. Materials had to arrive exactly on schedule. Labor forces had to be trained, coordinated, and sustained under relentless pressure. Any delay rippled outward, threatening the entire system. There was no margin for complacency, only constant adjustment. Mistakes were inevitable, and some were costly. Cracks appeared. Procedures were rewritten midstream. Yet each failure was met not with retreat, but with refinement. The system learned because it had to. The goal was never perfection, it was replacement. As long as ships reached the water faster than they could be sunk, the strategy held. The revelation was strategic in scope. Speed transformed industrial output into a shield. The enemy could still strike, still sink, still destroy, but the effect was blunted. The Atlantic ceased to be a choke point and became a corridor. Convoys grew steadier. Supply lines stabilized. Momentum, once fragile, became self-sustaining. In the end, speed did more than accelerate production. It altered the nature of the war itself. The Allies no longer fought to avoid loss. They fought knowing loss could be endured. And as ships continued to slide from the docks in relentless succession, the enemy faced a truth as unforgiving as the sea that time, once on his side, had begun to run out. The struggle reached its most intense form along America's coasts, where shipyards ceased to resemble places of industry and instead became engines of war. From the Pacific Northwest to the Gulf Coast, entire waterfronts were transformed into military hubs. Cranes moved day and night. Steel rang constantly. Hulls emerged in disciplined sequence, each one following the last with mechanical certainty. The shipyards no longer responded to demand, they anticipated it. What made this transformation remarkable was not only its scale, but its endurance. Workers labored through extended shifts, 6 and sometimes 7 days a week. Fatigue was constant and unavoidable. The irony was sharp. The same people building vessels to cross dangerous seas rarely saw daylight beyond the yard gates. Yet the pressure to deliver never lifted. Every completed ship represented lives protected elsewhere, convoys sustained, and fronts held together by supply rather than hope. As production accelerated, a new tension emerged. Speed had become the defining advantage, but it carried risk. Welding crews moved faster than inspection teams could comfortably follow. Mistakes that once would have halted construction were now documented, corrected, and absorbed without stopping the line. Quality control became a race within a race, maintaining seaworthiness without sacrificing momentum. The sea would punish error, but the war punished delay even more. Supervisors faced impossible choices: slow down and risk falling behind the enemy's sinkings, or press forward and trust in learning through repetition. The decision was made collectively, often silently. Production did not pause. Instead, systems adapted. Weak points were reinforced, procedures refined. Each failure became data, folded back into the process. The shipyards learned at the same pace they built. As the number of Liberty ships increased, their strategic effect became impossible to ignore. German U-boat commanders reported sinkings with diminishing satisfaction. For every vessel destroyed, another appeared, and then another. The ocean, once a hunting ground, began to feel crowded. Convoys grew denser, escorts more confident. The balance of risk shifted steadily away from the attacker. The revelation was not dramatic, but cumulative. No single launch ended the U-boat threat. No single ship guaranteed victory. But together, these vessels applied pressure the Axis could not relieve. Submarines required time, training, fuel, and secrecy. The Allied response required only continuation. As long as the shipyards remained active, losses could be endured and dominance reclaimed. Workers sensed this long before official reports confirmed it. They saw it in production charts climbing despite fatigue, in launch ceremonies that grew shorter and more frequent. In the absence of celebration, replaced by routine, victory here did not arrive with applause. It arrived with schedules met and quotas exceeded. By late in the campaign, the shipyards themselves had become a form of weaponry. Not glamorous, not visible to the enemy, but decisive. Germany's U-boat strategy depended on scarcity, on making shipping too costly to sustain. The shipyards answered with abundance. The shock beneath the Atlantic came not from a sudden reversal, but from persistence. German U-boats continued to strike with deadly precision, sending Allied ships to the bottom in flames and silence. For crews crossing the ocean, the threat remained constant and intimate. Torpedoes still found their marks. Convoys still scattered in darkness. Yet amid the wreckage, something unexpected was becoming clear. The ships now entering the Atlantic were proving harder to remove from the war than anyone had anticipated. From the beginning, belief in the Liberty ship had been cautious at best. Built quickly, welded rather than riveted, and stripped of refinement, it was assumed to be vulnerable to the Atlantic's cruelty. Critics predicted structural failure under heavy seas and catastrophic damage from enemy fire. Speed, they argued, had come at the cost of strength. The ocean would expose that weakness soon enough. What unfolded instead was an irony few had foreseen. The very qualities that made the Liberty ship appear crude gave it resilience. Its simple design absorbed damage without complex cascading failures. Its cargo holds, subdivided and utilitarian, limited flooding. Even when struck, many ships remained afloat long enough for crews to abandon ship or, in some cases, to save the vessel entirely. What was meant to be expendable proved stubbornly difficult to erase. For U-boat commanders, the struggle became increasingly frustrating. Attacks that once guaranteed results now produced diminishing returns. Sinkings still occurred, but the strategic effect weakened. One ship destroyed no longer represented months of lost effort. It represented days. The volume of Allied shipping entering the Atlantic grew faster than torpedoes could remove it. The ocean, once defined by absence and fear, began to feel crowded. German submarines faced limits that production could not solve. Each patrol required trained crews, fuel, maintenance, and time. Losses were harder to replace. Allied anti-submarine tactics improved steadily, but even without them, the math was turning cruel. The U-boats were fighting an enemy that did not tire, did not hesitate, and did not slow. They were fighting a system. The revelation was not announced in communiques or marked by a single decisive engagement. It emerged gradually, in the changing tone of reports. Sinkings were still counted, but so were arrivals. Harbors filled. Convoys became routine rather than desperate. Supply lines stabilized, then strengthened. The Allies no longer wondered whether shipping losses would cripple the war effort. They planned as though supplies would arrive because increasingly they did. This shift altered everything above the waves. Armies advanced knowing fuel and ammunition would follow. Aircraft flew longer and more often. Strategic decisions expanded, freed from the constraints of scarcity. The Atlantic ceased to be a gamble and became a guarantee. What had once threatened to strangle the war effort now sustained it. For Germany, the consequences were severe and irreversible. The U-boat campaign had depended on breaking morale through loss, on convincing the Allies that the cost of transport outweighed its benefit. That logic collapsed under the weight of production. The submarines still hunted. As the war progressed, the nature of struggle quietly evolved. The clash of armies and fleets remained brutal and decisive, but another front line emerged far from gunfire. It ran through shipyards, steel mills, and assembly halls, where efficiency and endurance replaced maneuver and firepower. Here, victory was measured not in territory taken, but in output sustained. The production line had become a battlefield in its own right. This transformation carried a profound irony. The factories that produced Liberty ships, once symbols of civilian industry, became as essential to the war's outcome as the soldiers landing on hostile shores or the sailors escorting convoys through darkness. A welder's shift could shape a campaign. A delayed shipment could stall an offensive. The distance between factory floor and front line collapsed, bound together by logistics and time. Pressure mounted relentlessly. Allied planners understood that production could never pause, never plateau. Every successful operation created new demands: more fuel, more ammunition, more vehicles. As armies advanced deeper into Europe and across the Pacific, the supply lines stretched longer and thinner. The burden fell back on the factories to compensate, to push harder, faster, and longer than ever before. There was no final quota, only the next requirement. Inside the shipyards, this pressure became routine. Schedules tightened further. Maintenance was performed between shifts rather than during shutdowns. Output charts replaced calendars as the measure of progress. Workers aged visibly under the strain, yet absenteeism remained low. The war allowed no illusion of detachment. News from the front filtered back in fragments, casualty lists, victories, setbacks, and reinforced a shared understanding that production failures carried human consequences. The Axis powers faced a different reality. Their industries, constrained by bombing, resource shortages, and geographic limits, struggled to match Allied output. Each lost ship, aircraft, or vehicle carried greater weight. Replacement took time the war no longer offered. Where Allied production absorbed losses almost indifferently, Axis production felt every blow. The imbalance widened steadily, driven not by sudden breakthroughs, but by sustained pressure. The revelation, when it came, was unmistakable. This war would not be decided solely by superior tactics or singular battles. It would be decided by systems. The Allies had built a machine that could learn, adapt, and expand under stress. Errors were corrected without halting momentum. Shortages were rerouted around. Destruction was met with replacement rather than retreat. Liberty ships embodied this logic perfectly. They were not expected to survive indefinitely. They were expected to exist in sufficient numbers, for long enough, to carry the war forward. And they did. Each launch reinforced a simple truth. As long as the production lines held, the war effort would endure. The enemy could strike, but could not exhaust the source. Over time, the meaning of the battlefield itself changed. The shock was no longer contained to spreadsheets or internal reports. It was visible from the air, from the docks, from the convoy lanes stretching across the Atlantic. Liberty ships were being launched in numbers that defied earlier projections. What had begun as an emergency solution had expanded into a sustained industrial surge. Shipyards that once measured success in single launches now counted them in sequences. The water seemed to fill with hulls, each one a quiet assertion that the pace of war had changed. With this surge came a profound shift in belief. The Allies were no longer reacting to losses. They were shaping the environment in which the war was fought. Shipping, once the fragile link in the chain, became a position of strength. Convoys sailed with greater regularity and confidence. Supplies arrived, not sporadically, but predictably. The Atlantic, long contested and feared, was becoming an artery rather than an obstacle. The irony of this transformation was unmistakable. Only a short time earlier, the idea of producing ships at this scale had been dismissed as fantasy. Skilled labor shortages, material constraints, and engineering limits were thought to make such output unattainable. Yet the very scale that once seemed impossible had become routine. Launches no longer drew crowds. They were scheduled, expected, and quickly followed by the next. What had once been extraordinary faded into procedure. This moment marked a turning point not defined by a single event, but by accumulation. The overwhelming number of Liberty ships deployed across the Atlantic ensured that Allied supply lines could not be severed. Sinkings still occurred, but they were absorbed into a system designed for replacement rather than preservation. The enemy could strike effectively, but no longer decisively. The war at sea shifted from a contest of interdiction to one of inevitability. German U-boat commanders recognized the change before it was fully articulated by Allied leadership. Patrols yielded results that no longer altered the strategic picture. For every report of success, new convoys appeared. The sea lanes grew crowded, layered with escorts and traffic. The effort required to maintain pressure increased, while the returns diminished. The imbalance was not tactical, it was structural. The revelation lay in the scale itself. This was not merely efficient production, it was dominance through volume. The Allies had built a system that operated beyond the enemy's capacity to disrupt it. Germany's submarine force, formidable and well-led, faced an opponent that could replace losses faster than attacks could be planned. The Atlantic campaign ceased to be a race and became a mismatch of endurance. Above the waterline, the effects were immediate and far-reaching. Armies advanced with confidence that supply would follow. Strategic planners expanded their ambitions, freed from the fear of logistical collapse. Operations once considered too risky became feasible. The flow of fuel, ammunition, vehicles, and food stabilized entire theaters of war. Shipping was no longer the constraint, it was the enabler. What made this revolution enduring was not technology alone, but organization. The Liberty ship program proved that scale could substitute for precision, that resilience could outweigh vulnerability. It redefined what industrial warfare meant. Victory no longer depended solely on preventing loss, but on ensuring continuity. As long as the launches continued, the war effort remained intact. By the time the full scope of production was understood, the struggle at sea had always been defined by scarcity. Every convoy represented risk. Every sinking carried consequences far beyond the moment of impact. Early in the war, naval strategy revolved around protection, how to preserve what little merchant shipping the Allies possessed. But as Liberty ships entered service in growing numbers, that logic began to fracture. The sheer volume of vessels forced a fundamental rethink of what naval warfare could look like when loss was no longer decisive. The shock was subtle but profound. The Atlantic had long been an unforgiving space, where Allied losses mounted faster than replacements could arrive. Now, for the first time, ships could be replenished almost as quickly as they were destroyed. Convoys no longer felt irreplaceable. Sinking still mattered, but they no longer dictated strategy. The sea ceased to be a place of constant retreat and became a domain the Allies could occupy with confidence. There was deep irony in this reversal. Only a short time earlier, the war had threatened to turn on a shortage of merchant ships. Supplies had bottlenecked. Campaigns had stalled. German planners believed that attrition alone could force a strategic collapse. Instead, the very factor meant to strangle the Allied war effort, shipping became its greatest strength. Mass production did not merely solve a problem, it inverted it. As Liberty ships multiplied, naval strategy adjusted accordingly. Protection remained important, but desperation faded. Escorts grew more aggressive. Routes became more predictable. Commanders planned operations, assuming losses would occur and that they could be absorbed. This shift freed decision-making from fear. Risk became manageable. Momentum became sustainable. The turning point was not marked by a single convoy or engagement. It arrived quietly, as numbers accumulated beyond the enemy's reach. With more ships than the Axis could ever hope to destroy, the war of attrition tilted decisively. U-boats could still hunt, still strike, still claim victories, but those victories no longer changed outcomes. Destruction had lost its strategic power. This imbalance reshaped the tempo of the entire war. Armies moved faster because supplies followed without interruption. Air forces expanded operations because fuel deliveries were dependable. Planning horizon lengthened. The Allies no longer fought with one eye on collapse. They fought with confidence in continuity. The logistics of war, once its greatest vulnerability, became its strongest pillar. The revelation extended far beyond naval charts. The Liberty ship was not a tactical weapon, but a systemic one. It did not win battles directly. It ensured battles could be fought at all. Its contribution lay in reliability, repetition, and scale. Where previous wars had been constrained by supply, this one was liberated by it. By the time production reached its peak, the numbers told a story no rhetoric could improve. More than 2,700 Liberty ships had entered service. Each one represented cargo delivered, pressure sustained, and time gained. Together, they formed a network so dense that it resisted collapse by design. The Axis powers could disrupt it locally, but not dismantle it entirely. In this sense, the Liberty ship changed the nature of victory. Success no longer depended on flawless execution or the avoidance of loss. It depended on the ability to endure loss without breaking. That endurance was built not on heroism alone, but on planning, organization, and industrial resolve. The war at sea did not end when the last ship was launched. It ended when, by the later years of the war, the Atlantic supply lines had become a permanent fixture of Allied strategy. Operations were planned with confidence that ships would arrive, that losses would be absorbed, that momentum would continue. The fear that once haunted convoy routes receded into background noise. The war at sea did not end, but it ceased to dominate decision-making. In this sense, the Liberty ship achieved something rare. It altered expectations. It transformed vulnerability into persistence. It taught commanders that durability could be distributed rather than concentrated. A ship need not be perfect. It needed to be present, and present again. The Battle of the Atlantic was not won by a single breakthrough or decisive weapon. It was won by accumulation of steel, of labor, of time. The Liberty ship stood at the center of that accumulation. Not glamorous, not celebrated, but undefeated in the only sense that mattered. Even when sunk, it succeeded. Its replacement was already under construction. Its cargo would be carried by another hull. The system absorbed loss without hesitation. The enemy could inflict damage, but not defeat. In the end, the Liberty ship became more than a vessel. It became proof that wars of attrition are decided not by who strikes hardest, but by who endures longest. And as the Atlantic convoys continued their steady passage, one truth emerged with quiet clarity. The ship that was never meant to be remembered had become the key to victory beneath the waves. The shock came not from triumph, but from survival. Again and again, Liberty ships returned to port scarred, listing, and blackened by fire yet still afloat. Torpedoes struck, bombs fell, steel plates buckled, and still, many of these vessels refused to sink. What had been designed as expendable began to acquire a reputation that bordered on the legendary. In a war where destruction was expected, endurance became the surprise. This endurance carried a sharp irony. The Liberty ship had been conceived in haste, stripped of elegance, and built for speed rather than longevity. Critics had warned that such ships would break apart under stress, that welded hulls would fail in heavy seas or under attack. Yet time and combat told a different story. Their simple construction absorbed damage in ways more complex vessels could not. Crude, they proved resilient. Ordinary, they became dependable. As reports accumulated, the psychological balance of the Atlantic shifted. Crews learned that a hit did not always mean a death sentence. Damage control parties trained with confidence rather than panic. Escorts fought harder to protect ships that could survive long enough to be saved. The enemy's weapons remained deadly, but their certainty faded. Survival, once a matter of luck, became increasingly a matter of design. The turning point lay not in any single engagement, but in continuity. Supply lines that had once seemed fragile now persisted despite attack. Cargo arrived even when ships did not return whole. Repairs were made. Vessels re-entered service. The flow of fuel, food, and ammunition became a constant presence rather than a calculated risk. The Atlantic no longer threatened collapse. It promised delivery. German planners recognized the danger too late. Their strategy had depended on fragility, on the assumption that Allied shipping could be broken faster than it could be restored. The Liberty ship undermined that assumption entirely. It did not need to be invincible. It only needed to be resilient enough, often enough, to keep moving. In that arithmetic, the Axis position eroded with every failed kill. The revelation was unmistakable. The Liberty ship was not merely a transport vessel. It was a system component, designed to function within a larger framework of production, repair, and replacement. Its value lay not in individual survival, but in collective endurance. Where earlier wars had hinged on singular platforms, this one hinged on networks. The consequence of the Liberty ship program extended far beyond the Atlantic. It marked the beginning of a new era in the way wars were fought and sustained. Logistics, once treated as a secondary concern, emerged as a central pillar of strategy. The ability to move men, machines, and materials reliably across oceans reshaped planning at every level. The war was no longer constrained by what could be preserved, but empowered by what could be replaced. There was a quiet irony in how this transformation unfolded. The Liberty ship had begun as a provisional solution, an emergency response to an immediate crisis. It was never meant to redefine warfare. Yet what was dismissed as a temporary fix became one of the most decisive factors of the conflict. Its success revealed that durability in war did not always come from perfection, but from repeatability. This realization altered the logic of conflict itself. For the first time, an industrial power demonstrated that it could absorb destruction faster than the enemy could inflict it. Sinkings continued, but their strategic meaning evaporated. The war effort no longer recoiled from loss. It accounted for it. The calculus shifted from avoiding damage to ensuring continuity. The revelation lay in the numbers, but also in their implications. Mass production of ships once unthinkable at this scale proved that industry could function as a strategic weapon. The Liberty ship program did not merely supply the war, it sustained it. It allowed operations to proceed without the constant fear of logistical collapse. It gave commanders freedom to plan boldly, knowing the industrial base could support ambition. This shift reached far beyond naval warfare. Armies advanced with confidence that fuel and ammunition would follow. Air forces expanded their reach, freed from the constraints of scarcity. The pace of operations accelerated across every theater. The Liberty ship, unremarkable in isolation, became extraordinary in aggregate. It demonstrated that victory in modern war belonged to those who could organize production as effectively as combat. The irony deepened as the war progressed. The Axis powers, tactically skilled and often innovative, found themselves constrained by resources they could not replace. Each loss carried weight, each setback compounded. The Allies, by contrast, fought with a growing sense of inevitability not because they were immune to failure, but because their system could recover from it. In this context, the Liberty ship's true contribution became clear. It was not simply a vessel, but a proof of concept. It showed that mass production could redefine strategic limits. That scale could substitute for precision. That resilience could be engineered through repetition. These lessons would shape not only the remainder of the war, but the conflicts that followed. By the war's end, the implications were undeniable. The ability to outproduce an enemy to build faster than they could destroy had become a decisive advantage. The battlefield extended into factories, shipyards, and planning offices. War was no longer solely a test of courage or tactics, but of organization and endurance. The Liberty ship did not fire the shots that ended the conflict. It did not capture cities or accept surrenders, yet it made those outcomes possible. It carried the tools of victory across hostile seas, again and again, until resistance could no longer be sustained. In doing so, it redefined what winning a war could mean. What began as a hurried response to crisis became a lasting blueprint for modern warfare. The Liberty ship proved that industrial might, properly harnessed, could determine the fate of nations. And in that quiet, relentless logic, build faster, replace faster, endure longer, behind every Liberty ship that slid into the water stood thousands of hands that would never touch the sea. The war effort depended not only on admirals and generals, but on engineers, welders, riveters, planners, and laborers whose names rarely appeared in headlines. They worked far from the front lines, yet the outcome of battles depended on their precision and endurance. In the shipyards, the war was fought with tools, time cards, and unrelenting focus. These workers came from every corner of American society. Some were skilled craftsmen drawn from peacetime industry. Others were learning complex tasks for the first time, trained in weeks rather than years. Women filled positions once considered unreachable, stepping into roles left vacant by men sent overseas. Migrant labor reshaped entire cities as people followed opportunity to the coasts. Together, they formed a workforce as diverse as the nation itself. The irony of their contribution was profound. While soldiers and sailors faced visible danger, the labor behind them remained largely unseen. There were no parades for night shifts or medals for meeting quotas. Yet every hour worked in the yards carried direct consequences for those at sea. A weld made correctly meant a ship that held together under fire. A delay meant a convoy that sailed short. Their work, though invisible, shaped the war's trajectory. Conditions were demanding and often unforgiving. Shifts stretched long into the night. Safety standards evolved under pressure. Fatigue became a constant companion. Yet morale endured, sustained by a shared understanding of purpose. News from the front traveled quickly through the yards. Losses were felt personally. Each launch was not a celebration, but a quiet affirmation that effort could answer destruction. The revelation lay in how deeply human the Liberty ship program truly was. Steel and machinery mattered, but they were inert without coordination, discipline, and resolve. Production schedules reflected not only engineering efficiency, but collective will. When designs changed, workers adapted. When mistakes surfaced, they corrected them without pause. The system learned because people did. These shipyards became communities bound by urgency. Cafeterias, training rooms, and locker areas turned into spaces of shared resolve. Differences of background faded under the weight of deadlines. What united them was not ideology, but necessity. The work had to continue. The ships had to sail. As the war progressed, the scale of their achievement became clearer. The Liberty ships they built sustained armies, fueled aircraft, and carried relief to devastated regions. Yet few of those workers would ever see the results firsthand. Their victories arrived indirectly, through reports of advancing fronts and stabilizing supply lines. The distance between effort and outcome was vast, but the connection was absolute. In this sense, the Liberty ship was a human artifact as much as an industrial one. It embodied patience under pressure, adaptation under stress, and belief in continuity. The workers behind it proved that endurance could be organized, that resolve could be scheduled and repeated. Their labor transformed industrial capacity into strategic power. When the war ended, many of these yards fell silent. The urgency faded. Tools were set aside, but the imprint of that effort remained. The Liberty ships had. In the end, the Battle of the Atlantic was not decided by a single engagement. or a decisive maneuver. It was decided by accumulation, not just of victories, but of capacity. The sea remained dangerous until the final months of the war, but its danger lost strategic meaning. It was not the battleships or the planes alone that ensured victory on the waves. It was the ships made in days, arriving in numbers the enemy could not exhaust. This truth carried a moral weight that only hindsight could fully reveal. The Liberty ship was born not from ambition, but from necessity. It answered a crisis with pragmatism rather than brilliance. It was never meant to dominate headlines or redefine naval aesthetics. Yet it became the backbone of the Allied effort precisely because it accepted the limits of perfection. It did not seek to avoid loss. It planned for it. The Atlantic had once favored those who could strike unseen and disappear. Submarines thrived on scarcity, on the fragility of supply. The Liberty ship shattered that logic. By flooding the ocean with steel, the Allies denied the enemy the leverage of fear. Each sinking became less consequential. Each attack, less decisive. Over time, the ocean itself seemed to change character, not safer, but steadier. There was an irony at the heart of this transformation. The Axis powers pursued technical excellence and tactical innovation, often with remarkable results. Yet they were undone by a force that was neither elegant nor subtle. The Liberty ship did not outfight the U-boat. It outlasted it. It demonstrated that in wars of endurance, survival favors systems over moments, continuity over brilliance. This lesson extended far beyond shipping. The Allied war effort became defined by an ability to sustain pressure without collapse. Armies advanced, knowing supply would follow. Air forces planned campaigns without rationing flight hours. Strategy expanded because logistics no longer constrained it. Steel, shaped by schedules and repetition, made ambition possible. The moral closure of the Liberty ship's story lies in its humility. It was not designed to be remembered. It carried no promise of immortality. Many were scrapped within years of the war's end. Yet their purpose was fulfilled not in longevity, but in service. They existed to be used, replaced, and used again until resistance failed. In this sense, the Liberty ship redefined what victory could look like. It was not the triumph of a single weapon, but of an idea that industrial power, organized with discipline and restraint, could decide the fate of nations. That steel, applied patiently and relentlessly, could overcome ingenuity aimed at destruction. The Atlantic did not fall silent because the enemy stopped fighting. It fell silent because fighting no longer worked. Sinkings continued until the end, but they no longer shaped outcomes. The Allies had removed fragility from the equation. They had learned how to absorb loss without yielding ground. What began as a prototype became a prophecy. Build faster than the enemy can destroy. Replace what is lost without hesitation. Endure